East and West Learning Connections is hosting a grand opening book talks event for the new year. Our guest speaker today is George Elliott Clarke. He's a renowned Canadian poet, as well as a novelist, playwright, scholar, and social activist. He has won many awards, such as the Governor General's Award, Canada's highest literary award, the Martin Luther King Achievement Award, Order of Canada, and Poet Laureate of the Canadian Parliament. He has taught at Duke University and Harvard University, and he is currently a professor at the University of Toronto, where he lectures on African Canadian literature. This event will feature Clarke introducing his memoir, Where Beauty Survived. He will also read from his award-winning poetry collection. I'm currently reading his memoir, A World of Miniature Carvings Rich in Details with excellent descriptions of human emotions and scenery, and a subtle and profound touch. Traveling between the countryside and the city, between simplicity and elegance, the multidimensional characters grow like bright summer flowers amidst the contrasts of light and shadow, dramatic conflicts, and tension in life. The world is more than black and white, and this text does a really good job at showing its colors. Okay, one of the characters is the poet's father, who diligently practices his work ethics while working on the railway for decades. At the same time, he insisted on dressing exquisitely, speaking elegantly, reading a lot, attending concerts and art exhibitions, and maintaining a sharp and high level of intellectual life. He was good friends with Alistair MacLeod, who is a leading Canadian novelist whose works have recently been introduced and published in China. Clarke also has relatives who are poet laureates of the United States. There seem to be many sharp minds and bright talents in his direct and extended family, although they have to break through the restrictive conditions of the material world and psychological restraints. The process of breaking out of the cocoon, the power accumulated and displayed, has a strong artistic sense. The ethnic group that Clarke comes from, which he calls Afro-Canadian, is a mixture of various different ethnicities and colors, including West Indian Black, Indigenous brown, and Caucasian white. It is a legacy of the intersection of many historical and cultural influences. We can feel the rhythm of poetry in the memoirs and also experience the joys and sorrows of small figures in big times. I look forward to seeing my friends both online and offline in poetry and in color. Thank you.
Yeah, very nice. I am now visible online. As well as in person in the room. I want to thank East and West Learning Connections for inviting me to speak with you all here in the room of this particular Baptist church. And is the minister here for the church?
Mr. Fisher, yeah, it's the Toronto School for Strings and Piano.
Oh.
Have generously give this room to us. So yeah, thank you, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. And I also need to mention that my own pastor at Halifax's New Horizons Baptist Church asked me to say hello to him because she was here last year to speak at the church, being a Baptist minister. And I became baptized into the African Baptist version of Christianity last year, Easter Sunday, April 9th last year. So I probably am now fully redeemed and may now go out and commit all kinds of crimes. just kidding. Anyway, I also wanted to thank Yang for inviting me directly and also Ping for that beautiful introduction for myself that was read so beautifully and clearly and with a flourish. And I also need to say a thank you and a shout out to the League of Canadian Poets and reference the fact that they've also been supportive of tonight's gathering. So I'll begin by reading a little bit from this memoir, which is, of course, Where Beauty Survived. And it was published in 2021. And it is a memoir. And I started writing it, and Giovanna, my companion, who is also here, realizes the truth of this. So I started writing it, I think it was in 2018, 2017, 2018. And really couldn't, it really didn't have a handle on it. It was hard to talk about myself. And it was hard to talk about my family and the actual things that happened in my boyhood and my childhood. It was very difficult. And also couldn't really figure out what to emphasize in trying to write a memoir. And so my editor at Knopf Canada said, what you need to do is just write about the first 20 years of your life. Just focus on that. And when I thought about that, everything started to make sense. I started to find my way into the story of my own life. And this is also, so I really started writing it during the first wave, the first lockdowns, the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course started in COVID-19 in 2019 and is still going on, still continuing, no matter what people try to say about it. It's still, this little opening bit is called Impetus. And it's based on a dream, a real dream I had in the fall of 2020. We had gone down to Leamington for a break, just for a week or something like that. And one of the few places we could go outside of Toronto. So we did. And I started writing this book there. And so here it is. Where to begin to chronicle my beginnings? It has to be here in this dream from October 2020, which I experienced as I was editing this memoir. I recognized the truth of the dream immediately, and that is why I narrate it here. In the dream, I am my current age, 60. And my father, William Lloyd Clarke, is likely 70, the age at which he passed away in 2005. I'm standing in the bedroom that he shares with his second wife. I'll call her Pammy, who is likely 60-something and whom I never accepted, liked, or loved, but only tolerated. For I could not see how she could replace my mother, Geraldine. Though Pammy is also deceased, she is alive in my dream, but leaves the marital bedroom so that my father and I can speak. I am standing waiting for him to apologize, to say that he is sorry for his role in the splitting up of his first and my birth family. He is dressed conservatively as usual, a shirt and tie under a V-neck sweater, and he does begin to apologize, saying, son, just as I've wished forever. And as he relates his regret, I cannot restrain the damn burst of tears that erupts from my eyes, and I collapse over the heap of my books, all spread about me, which I know suddenly have all been written in yearning for his apology and his acceptance. So, as I was mentioning, that was a real dream. And I realized its importance psychologically and so on immediately. You know, I woke up and I wrote it down the next day and knew that I had to start this a memoir with that because, and I'll say it right now, I loved both my parents very much, and I still do. They are both passed on, my mom in 2000, my dad in 2005. I think about them every day. I miss them every day. I wish I could talk to them every day. I sometimes hope, dream, imagine that they might still be keeping an eye out for me and so on. I'd like to think that and tell myself that. And I can talk a little bit more about that as the evening progresses. But I'll also read now this very first part of the book of my childhood. One of the things that made me different as a boy compared to my two brothers is that I was born in the town of Windsor, Nova Scotia. And for me as a boy, that was one of the most important things because of the fact that I had a second home. It was a home in the country. Okay, we had our home in the city and so on, and I enjoyed being a city boy. I loved all the things that the city had to offer us in terms of movie cinemas, more than one, and playgrounds and all the activities that are available in a capital city as Halifax, Nova Scotia is. And was, of course, even then in the early 1960s. I was born in 1960, so I grew up, my childhood was basically in that decade. My brothers were born in 1961 and 1962. So we're all very close in age. As again, I was born in 60, so they were born very close in succession to me. But they were born in Halifax. And I always knew from the time I was born in Windsor. And for me, that just made me special. And besides, I was the firstborn, so I was special anyway, right? So special being the firstborn and special being born in Windsor, not in Halifax. And so this first part of the memoir talks about my relationship to that town, and it is very romantic. And I call this part Nature Boy, right? Because of the fact Windsor is a rural, situated in a rural setting, and it is a town. Um, so I start here with that. I was born in the country in the town of Windsor, Nova Scotia, just a few miles northerly and westerly of the historical African Nova Scotian settlements of Newport Station, 3 Mile Plains, and 5 Mile Plains, all dubbed collectively Windsor Plains. However, I grew up in the local big city and provincial capital that was Halifax, the unstated capital of all Atlantic Canada. My parents, William, Bill, and Geraldine, Jerry Clarke, took my 2 younger brothers and me for frequent visits to our maternal grandparents in Newport Station. But I was the only sibling with the distinction of being born there. I thought it made me special in relation to my Halifax-born brethren, namely Bryant, born 1961, and Billy, born 1962, for I possessed, in my fairy tale logic, a princely right to the countryside, while also having a citizen's claim on the city. I felt as a boy that I had 1 foot in Oz, so to speak, and 1 foot in Batman's Gotham City, if not yet Malcolm X's Harlem. But both locales were mine by practical birthright. My nanny's pear tree, which seemed always transfigured by lightning, loomed like a lone and stern prophet beside the driveway and in front of the hayfield next door to her home, which was always an oasis of pound cake and bologna and honey-flavored well water. Raised on margarine in Halifax, I still remember the day that I first tasted butter in a chicken sandwich that my granny made for my brothers and me. Indeed, the word pantry all by itself brings my granny's kitchen before me, and that table, which was always a bounty of plenty good eaten, bread and molasses, salted and vinegared sliced cucumbers from the garden, plus bowls of raspberries, blueberries, blackberries, strawberries, ice creams on occasion, and popcorn and nuts and potato chips. Whoa, not to mention hash browns and fried bacon, often slathered with green tomato chow chow. Even porridge or cold cereal gained from spoonfuls of sugar shoveled in, or bottles of honey or molasses inverted to release pleasing syrups upon otherwise wan, dull, bland bowls. Having access, I got to say this, going up home to Windsor to 3 Mile Plains and Newport Station from Halifax, whether by car, train, or bus, was like having Christmas cornucopia visited upon my brothers and me. The country really did mean bounty and blessing, even in terms of toys, for our cousin Scoop, whose mother, my Aunt Joan, had moved to Montreal to work, lived with my grandparents and was always loaded down with games and the like. So Bryant, Billy, and I loved to borrow his boxes of manufactured soldiers and spacecraft, his plastic cowboys and rubber Indians, his bouncing this and peculiar that, to while away the hours while our parents visited, and that to my child's mind, big house full of knickknacks and treasures, including a veranda that was always thick with angry buzzing flies that we 3 Clarke boys relished killing. Oh yeah, how satisfying to smack the plastic paddle swatter against those insane busybodies and smush those little bugs against the window panes. Oh my God, that's just terrible looking back on it now. I'll leap ahead to share another Green Street Newport Station moment with you that's kind of fun. And I will also just say that the very opening of this book is really focused on that lifestyle of the country and how much I loved it. Yeah, but I got to share some other like just items as part of that lifestyle. So back in those days, one of the most popular television shows in the Maritimes, alongside Hockey Night in Canada and Saturday afternoon wrestling matches. It was wrestling, not wrestling, wrestling matches, was Don Messer's Jubilee. As a boy who twisted to the Beatles' I Want to Hold Your Hand at age 4, I was no fan of Don Messer and his Prince Edward Islanders. City life seemed to demand raucous jive and jumpy rhythms, whereas country music required. Hello, everybody online. Thank you for being so interested in this. So anyway, the unskilled laborers around Yarmouth, Shelburne, and Liverpool, because they were forbidden the right to fish commercially. Nanny would sometimes do a little jig in her living room when a particularly winsome song reeled out the radio or the TV. Her brother, my great uncle Charlie Croxon, had made a living playing fiddle and guitar at shindigs all up and down the Annapolis Valley. His wife, my great aunt Mousie, sported the satin and spangled shirts of the Nashville Lady Stars and was fully and only a devotee of country and western. Later on, she led her own bands. Play one of her songs with an intoxicant in your hand and tell me that you don't break out in the heartiest, most cathartic tears. Charlie Pride and Ray Charles were big African-American country stars, but there were a bunch of Scotians, Africadians for whom Nashville was their go-to music too, either rivaling Motown, Manhattan, and Memphis, or displacing them altogether. I can't recall whether my grandfather, Bob Johnson, ever blew on a harmonica or played the spoons, but he did like country and western, of that I'm sure. For one thing, his home was full of calendar pictures that featured A, darling blonde cowgirls in satin and rhinestone outfits, B, white painted wooden churches mirrored in nearby streams, or C, a 100 kilowatt smile cowboy or a blonde maned horse, sometimes both, in the precincts of a chapel. Africadian culture was never only one type of specifically stereotypically Black cultural interests or practices. Rather, our Blackness could slide toward Nashville by way of Charlottetown, PEI, or tap the Metropolitan Opera by way of Truro, Nova Scotia. I've got to share this part with you as well. This is about my mom, my aunt, her sister, and my grandmother, their mom. As pleasurably garrulous as the guys' gatherings could be, all of creation would have to stop in its tracks when my mom, her mom, my Aunt Joan, and other countrified ladies would get together to gossip and sip tea, maybe a little beer too. Then they'd occupy the kitchen table and the adult males would be gone, likely banished from the premises. Let me tell you, when those 3 or 4 or 5 women got to laughing, their voices were obnoxious screeches, side-splitting hollers, guttural hee-haws, white noise, scratchy sounding cackles, just unadulterated in your eardrums pandemonium. I used to eavesdrop on the women by sitting out of sight at the top of the stairs. I had absolutely no idea what they were discussing, but their laughter was full body, awesome, thunderous, even scary. Their TVs sounded like tom-toms and their guffaws were kettle drums. What entertainment they gave each other and what men's and women's reputations were chortled over, chewed up and spat out rapturously or spitefully but delightfully degraded. One would have to resurrect Dante and revisit a corner of his Inferno to ever ascertain the comprehensiveness of their damnations. The world was divvied into bastards and bitches. And it still is. And I know we can say that because we're in the basement of the church. So it's all right. Divvied into bastards and bitches. When they let down their hair, so to speak, well, the gloves came off too. And no adult miscreant escaped their scorn and derision. When Nanny laughed, her tongue would slip slightly past her closed lips as she vented rib-shaking, earthy mirth. There's one more section I have to read here early on in the book, and it's about my parents and the parties they would have, and because of the fact that in the early 60s and well into actually the 80s and even the 90s, actually it was, I'm not misleading you, it was into the 1990s that Halifax nightlife was de facto segregated. And what that meant was that the nightclub owners, who were all white, would come up with ways that they would share. They would scheme, they would get together, and they would, and this all came out in an investigation carried out by the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission in 1991, 1992. So for my parents and their generation, and again, even into my own youth growing up in Halifax, it was very difficult for Black men to gain entry to the Halifax nightclubs. Very difficult. They would come up with lots of stratagems to make us unwilling or less likely to even want to go to those places. And in fact, when disco and funk became really popular in Halifax, some of the nightclubs switched over to country and western, knowing that for a lot of young Black men, there was just no way we were going to go and listen to country and western music, no matter how cheap the beer might be. So, but that's how devious these guys were. So what that meant was, and my parents had to do this, was they would put together what we called house parties. And basically every weekend, someone's home would be designated as the home that would host all of the partying, dancing, and drinking, and so on that could be permitted. So that's one of my favorite childhood memories. Is of course we weren't allowed to actually watch or stay up as the adults gathered to have their party. Or parties, I should say. And I really wish I had marked the pages, because it's been a while since I read from this book, and now I've given you all this buildup for that particular section that I wanted to read, and I'm starting to sweat and starting to feel embarrassed because I can't actually put my eyeglasses on it. So I'll find something else to talk about in the meantime as I continue to flip through this and look for that section. Well, you know what? I think what I'm going to do, as even though that's a whole lot of fun, is leap ahead and talk about some more difficult moments in my childhood and life, and it has to do with the breakup of my parents when I was a teenager. I was 12. And between the ages of 12 and 14, my parents began to break up, in essence. And they were finally divorced when I was 14. But I don't need to go into that right now, because I just found the section I was looking for before. So I'm going to keep you waiting for me to talk about their marital issues and how that impacted me and so on. But it's coming up. I promise you it's coming up. But I've got to read you this part right now. Returning to my North End boyhood, because when I was really young, we lived on the Bay Road outside of Halifax, really, or right on the outskirts of Halifax City. But at the age of 5, my family, when I was 5 years old, we all moved into downtown Halifax, North End of Halifax, which is the immigrant, working class, Black, Indigenous, part of Halifax. That's where Halifax is warehoused. Oh, and I forgot to mention the military families. Halifax is a major naval base. So all of us working class, immigrant, military brats, Black and Indigenous folks, we mainly lived in North End Halifax. And Halifax has been divided along class lines and race lines from the very moment it was founded in 1749. What happened was that the gentry immediately built a stockade around the downtown core of Halifax, where the government offices and military offices were located. And all of the poor and working class folks had to leave the downtown, inside of the palisade, inside the fencing, and had to move outside at sundown. They had to live outside of the protective fence, which of course was put up to protect the government offices, the settler institutions, from Indigenous people, right? But at the same time, everybody who was not part of the aristocracy, the landed gentry, had to be outside of the stockade, the palisade, the fencing. And so that was actually the origins of what became the North End of Halifax. So continuing on, sorry for that historical background. So returning to my North End boyhood, I can still say that visiting with my great aunt Portia's sister, my Nanny Clarke, was about as much fun as sensing a dentist's drill invading a tooth. Indeed, if entering my mom's parents' home in Newport Station was like entering a Disneyland of feast and frolic, going to Nanny Clarke's home was like going to penance, all somber and shadows. She was like my father, dark complected, and also like him, icily European in attitude. I mean, she seemed to project natural born hauteur, plus noblesse oblige, plus the softening, but lacking the softening element of charity. With my mom's parents, my brothers and I could be playful, although our maternal grandfather could be gruff when he was not taciturn or whistling or spitting black phlegm into the stove. Still, he didn't pose as reverential. Yet we had to approach our dad's mom as if she were regal, even saintly. I deem our household a blend of European and Black influence, with the general precept being follow Caucasian norms where beneficial, reject them when they seem inhumane. So Dad always had Bach, Beethoven, or Brahms circulating on the turntable, and he'd whistle along while he bent over a painting in progress. But when he wasn't hogging the hi-fi or the radio, tuned to CBC, when within his earshot, Jerry, my mom could throw down the Platters, the Supremes, James Brown, Aretha Franklin, all the soul and R&B that she loved. Happily, they both agreed on the Beatles and Broadway. So there'd be Belafonte crooning, or, excuse me, or Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone exploding steely and gnarly out of transistors, or there'd be the Gershwin brothers, Porgy and Bess, plus a blast of Bizet's, Carmen, or Puccini's Madama Butterfly. Nor can I omit Henry Mancini's Pink Panther soundtrack that was also music to which we could all cha-cha-cha. However, church music was never heard, not at home. Not even spirituals got played. And I was an adult before I understood how strange that was, because we were a church-going family, but there was never church music in our home, never. But Dad's dad, though mysteriously absent, hailed from Jamaica. And so Bill Clarke had a cache of 1930s Calypso records, along with the Mary Poppins soundtrack, Duke Ellington's sassy LP, A Drum is a Woman, and a 45 of Shirley Bassey belting Goldfinger. He gave my brothers and me a naughty Calypso. And here's the punchline. I kissed her lips, I kissed her hands, and I left her behind for you. Thank you. We laughed uproariously at the singer's emphasis on behind. Though too young to know the phrase double entendre, we did get the sassy double meaning of that bottom dollar line. When Bill helmed the radio, classical music issued. When my mother commandeered the airways, we got to hear top 40 pop songs, everything from the Itsy Bitsy Teeny Weeny Yellow Polka Dot Bikini to Lost Someone, A Million to One. Those collisions of tunes, like my father's collages, all suggested that wholeness in art is always a callaloo, a stew, a medley. Whatever their different tastes in music, my parents knew that when hosting friends and relatives for a party, only Black music, funky, bluesy, earthy, guttural, sweet, salty, spicy would suffice. Indeed, the house party was an Africadian custom. Until the 1990s in Halifax, white-owned nightclubs often barred most Black men using any pretext, or were expensive, though pouring watered-down iced-up drinks. And so weekly in the 1960s, select households would lay in a store of booze, a stack of 45s, plus crackers, sardines, olives, potato chips, beer nuts, and invite a mix of singles and couples to come and waltz and sing and hum and shindig and grope and drink and smoke until somewhere around about 3 a.m. Whenever my parents hosted a gathering, my brothers and I would be dispatched to our bedrooms or allowed to watch television in our parents' bedroom, but we definitely had to be shut away from the adults, apart from presenting perfunctory, respectful greetings to any early arrivals. We'd have to disappear by 7 or 8 p.m., and then the party would start hopping assuredly by 9 p.m. Naturally, Bryant and Bill and I would make up excuses to slip downstairs because the presence of all these Black, brown, white adults, couples, singles, relatives was strange and exciting. When I go downstairs to the kitchen, I'd try to sneak a glimpse of those mysterious cackling goings on. I'd see that the living room was opaque, dense, black, with multicolored people, a few pale girls in the mix. I always wondered when I'd beg a glass of milk from my tolerant, this time smiling parents, how did so many adults compress themselves into those compressing corners of the living room? And what possible pleasure could they gain from the physical pressure of having to dance, stand, sit, almost always tightly intertwined? Must have been the music, the songs that let the couples brush against each other, press against each other, melt into each other to kiss lips, hair, eyelids, cheeks. Laughter was guffaws, roars, body, or folks' voices receded to whispers. Cigarette smoke was an amoeba against the ceiling and then slowly silted down, saturating every close clinging body and all the tight clinging clothes. Pumps would slide off so nylon or bare feet could shift and shuffle over the carpet. Men's brogues got untied or their loafers would get kicked off. Somehow, anywhere between a dozen to 24 adults could clinch and clutch and kiss and tighten up in our living room. The lights off and or the lamps covered over. The record player spinning the slow jams, the waltzes, so that the couples could really feel each other as female hips ground into male groins. These nights were when the serious music got played, the rhythm and blues that went well with rum and coke or rye and ginger. It was all blue light, black light, Millie Jackson and James Brown and Peaches and Herb. Nor were the drinks skimpy, i.e. half water, with ice bulking up the content to dull the ache of absent alcohol. I confess that the foregoing portrait is part childhood memory and part adult observation. In my late teens, in 78 to 79, the house party was still a favorite means of entertainment because the Halifax Dartmouth nightclub still screened out black men. I imagine that what I enjoyed in the latter 70s, my parents enjoyed the previous decade. Sometimes I'd wonder if my father regretted not playing his Beethoven on such nights, but he knew, as did my mom, that the folks were assembling to hear their music, black music, the music of real love, physical love, and orgasmic satisfaction, saturating every corpuscle and follicle and nerve end and brain cell. The artistry of European classicists, could it compete with the moans and cries and hollers and howls born out of plush-lipped Negro mouths and the guttural depths of the tuneful soul and properly tuned heart? Could it make you want to love and be loved, to get down and get happy? In my dad's 1959 diary, he recounts an incident where he invited a black couple to audit his preferred music, either classical or crooners, and became irked when they poo-pooed it. So irritated was he made them leave his premises. I'm guessing that he clutched the serious music LPs to his chest as a means of saying to the world, I may be a Negro worker, but my tastes are more refined than those of many middle-class Caucasians, and so I am their equal, if not their superior. But this predilection was also his inheritance, given his own childhood and so forth. Excuse me. If a guy got too plastered at one of my parents' parties, he'd stay overnight snoring on the sofa or the living room floor until he became elastic enough to move on. As a boy, it was always disconcerting or disgusting for me to get up from bed and go downstairs into those morning after situations where cigarette butts would float with olive pits in one rum and coke tumbler or some almost empty glass of ale. There'd be the stink of stale beer, the revolting tang of cigarette smoke saturated clothes. But it was also exciting to experience the aftershock of explicitly non-Baptist activities and then dressed up, troop off to Sunday school. By the time the regular church service began at 11 a.m., even the hardest partying Saturday night adult would show suave and spiffy. Assuredly, God was awfully tolerant of Black Baptist sinners. That's why I'm a Baptist. I expect some tolerance, crying out loud. Please. I should pause here and ask if you have any questions about anything I've read, and I can also talk about other parts of the book. I promised to talk about my parents' divorce and so on, and the impact that had on me as a teen. But I can also talk about what happened to me as a teenager. And I mean, really, and Giovanna knows this book really well and can ask questions and tell you more about it. But I want to say, like, to really break it down, as I understand this book, is that really it's about the making of a working class intellectual. That is really what this book is about. Because in my community, which of course came from folks escaping slavery, folks who were enslaved and then got liberated, either freed by emancipation or liberated themselves, right? They stayed in Nova Scotia, were given the worst possible land to somehow survive upon. And because of the apartheid structure in Nova Scotia, deliberate apartheid structure, the deliberate apartheid structure in Nova Scotia, which was consecrated by a government decree, government design. The colonial government in Nova Scotia, which I got to share this with you. It's going to shock some of you. I know it's going to surprise some of you, but everybody thinks Nova Scotia was founded by Scots. Yeah, it's not true. Now, of course, they went to Cape Breton. Obviously, Cape Breton is where most of the Scottish immigrants settled when they arrived in 1777, aboard a ship called the Hector. And they mainly went to Cape Breton and eastern Nova Scotia. Antigonish is a name some of you might recognize. Pictou, New Glasgow. These are places where the Scots went. But mainland Nova Scotia generally was settled by Americans. Sincerely, Americans. These are people who were going to become officially American in another 20 years. When they arrived in 1760, they brought at least 200 African-American enslaved people with them. And so they were the main body of settlers in Nova Scotia. And they came from Dixie, they came from New England, and they came from slaveholding territories. So Nova Scotia began as a slaveholding state. I mean, there was slavery in colonial Ontario, colonial Quebec, of course, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. But none of those colonies were actually established primarily by slaveholders, right? There were slaveholders in those colonies, but they weren't established by slaveholders. Nova Scotia was established by slaveholders. It was a slaveholders colony, for crying out loud. So people sometimes say about Nova Scotia today, oh, it's the Mississippi of the North. And people in Nova Scotia get mad and say, oh, we're not Mississippi. Why are you calling us that? They don't know their own history. They don't understand their own history. They don't understand that the whole province, and especially the mainland, was set up to benefit the incoming slaveholding Americans who were constituted the government settlers. They were the government settlers. The Scots weren't. The Scots were off in Cape Breton, and they didn't really get to exercise any real power in Nova Scotia until the 20th century, right? So Nova Scotia began as a slave-holding state. It was a slave state. We ought to remember that when Nova Scotia was being settled by Yankees and folks from Dixie, the mainland, that is, America didn't exist yet. It was all British America. So that means that Nova Scotia was a slave state like the other slave states. It was a slave state like the other slave states, for crying out loud. The only difference is that it didn't have as many slaves. But in terms of the culture, in terms of the legal system, it was exactly a slave state. So to fast forward to the present, what I'm trying to get at here is that the vast majority of Black people in Nova Scotia were treated as a lumpen proletariat, cheap, disposable labor. And in order to reinforce that status, which lasted for at least 200 years, from 1760 to 1960, when things began to shift and change and move a little bit, Black ex-slave people, Black folks fleeing slavery in the United States were given deliberately the worst possible land. It was stony or it was swampy, and they were given very little of that land, even though it was really awful land. And but the government of Nova Scotia, not wanting them to stay, or if they were to stay, wanting them to only serve as cheap disposable labor, was surprised that so many of the mainly incoming African-American settlers, or I shouldn't say settlers, but immigrants, refugees, fugitives, decided to stay. They were really surprised by that. But they didn't understand one very important thing. When you have people who have never been able to own anything, never being able to own their labor, not being able to own property, not being able to own their children, to own a spouse, their spouses, all of whom could be sold away at a moment's notice by any master who needed the money or just wanted to teach somebody a lesson. And so to suddenly be given a piece of terrible land, an acre, 2 acres, half an acre. And so you've got something that's finally yours. In quotation marks, it's yours. Even though you were never given title to that land. You're only given tickets of occupation. As a matter of fact, this is going to freak out some people, but I got to tell you the truth. Back in 1841, the people of North Preston, Nova Scotia petitioned the provincial government, the colonial government, to have title to their land. Right, so they would be able to sell it if they wanted to, or move and so on, and not be tied to the land. The government of Nova Scotia never answered that petition until 2021. Yeah, 2021. 180 years later, the government of Nova Scotia said, yeah, we think we can give you title to that land now. 180 years later. Right? So that goes to show just how deep the apartheid structures in Nova Scotia were in terms of colonial governance. And so people, they stayed because they had something they could call their own. And the power of that, which took me a long time to understand it, because I don't understand simple things sometimes. It takes a long time to get to understand simple things. But when these refugee, fugitive, impoverished, despised folks end up with a little piece of land. And then they've got neighbors who come from the same background as themselves. They all got a little piece of land too. And then they all start putting up their huts and shacks. I don't mind calling them huts and shacks. And in some cases, they dug holes in the ground and put lean-tos over them, protect themselves from inclement weather, but actually lived in holes in the ground that they dug out for themselves in order to survive winter. Right? And also with the help of the indigenous people who helped them survive their first winters in Nova Scotia. But now you got a little clutch of huts and shacks. And then you got children. And the children the parents are happy. They are so pleased, they're ecstatic, because now their children are in their homes. And nobody's going to take them and sell them. They're in their homes and under their own roofs. Oh yeah, the roofs are leaky. Oh yeah, they've got to put furs or whatever they can find, or spruce tree limbs or pine tree limbs over the holes that they use for windows. And it's cold and it's hard to keep a fire going, and they're hungry. Yeah, but they've got something that's theirs, and they now have a little community. And the community is called Beachville, or it gets called Windsor Plains, it gets called Weymouth Falls, it gets called Preston or North Preston, East Preston, Cherrybrook, Lake Lewin. All of a sudden, you've got 52 little Black communities all around Nova Scotia, all anchored by a church or a chapel. And then eventually there's agitation for schools. So even though the Nova Scotia government never had it in mind that these folks would stay, or that they would put down roots, or that they could become viable communities, despite the prejudice, despite the poverty, despite the illiteracy, despite the police persecution, right? Police persecution, absolutely, from the very beginning down to the present, and actually took pride in their communities. Africville comes to mind as the community that was destroyed by the city of Halifax in the 1960s. And the people of Africville, the survivors of Africville, still think of Africville as being home, still want to go back there. And every year they gather on the Africville site and for the Africville Genealogical Society's reunion. This is a long way of saying, as I started to talk about this book being about the creation of a working class intellectual. So to get to the point of all this long history, my community was deliberately created and structured to be a relatively uneducated, poorly educated, virtually illiterate group of people who would work forever for the cheapest wages possible. And if they didn't like it, they could leave and go to Montreal or go to New York or go to Toronto or go up to Northern Ontario, to Sudbury, Thunder Bay, and so on if they couldn't hack Nova Scotia. Those were the choices. But in the 1960s, there began to be a revolutionary movement. And I use that word deliberately because it was spearheaded by the teachers. by Black women and white women who realized that now that the schools were officially desegregated, it did not mean that racism was over. This was a really key insight that they developed. They understood that just because Black and white kids could go to school together in Halifax and in Nova Scotia in general, that did not mean that racism had ended. You could still have racist teachers. You could still have racist textbooks. You could still have racist school administrators, principals, and vice principals, and so on. And so what started to happen is, of course, as Black kids come into the school system, they are very quickly labeled as troublemakers and pushed out of the school system. So the system is still operating in a way to refuse Black pupils a proper education. So what working class Black women and middle class white women did was organize preschool movements. When I say that, it sends a shiver down my spine. Preschool, who could have imagined preschool being a revolutionary movement? But it actually was, because what it meant was, my mom was a preschool teacher for a good chunk of her life. I really believed in early childhood education strongly, because what that meant was that you could take poor kids, working class kids, immigrant kids, and give them a head start to get them ready to enter what was still a racist and classist education system, and give them a fighting chance to survive all of those isms that were arrayed against them and make their way finally through the system and into high school and then possibly into university after that. But it had to start with the preschool movement. And that did start in the early 1960s, almost at the same time that the schools were officially desegregated. I've been talking too much. I gotta leave room for some questions. I gotta read some poetry too. I have to. But one other quick thing to say about all this, and still talking about formation of a working class intellectual. So when I'm going through school, I've got parents who are really insistent on my doing well in school. I have teachers also who are really significant in pushing me through. My own kindergarten teacher was Alexa McDonough, the late leader of the NDP, was my kindergarten teacher, right? So I had lots of people in my background who were really pushing me to get through school and so on. And I did ultimately, but really it was with the support of 6 elders, mentors, and I won't go into all kinds of details about them, but I will tell you who they were. And I was so lucky to have them come into my life when I was 17, 18. But Rocky Jones, who was Canada's foremost Black radical in the 1960s, he took me under his wing. His wife, Joan Jones, was one who ordered me to go to university, forced me to go to university, because I was thinking I was going to hang out and be a hippie, right? She said, no, you're going to go to university. She put her finger in my face, said, you're going to go to university. Okay, if you insist. I was really afraid. I didn't think I could survive. But she really made it possible. Walter Borden, playwright, actor, journalist, teacher, was a very significant mentor to me, taught me a lot about Black history, as did Rocky Jones, a lot about writing, and also he had a great stage presence as an actor and orator, so on. And they were all Black. And Sylvia Hamilton, who was a cousin of mine, also a filmmaker, and the first adult Black woman I ever knew who was an intellectual through and through. All right, and she was really supportive of me getting into poetry and getting me to go to conferences for creative writing and all of that, and also really big on social activism, community organization, and so on. Her husband, Bev Greenlaw, who's white, was also a real important part of the community. He was a basketball coach, but also an intellectual, right? So he was, they were both extremely important to me in my later teens. And finally, I got to mention as well, Jackie Barkley. Now, Jackie Barkley was a social worker and a fire-breathing communist, a Marxist-Leninist, who got me reading, and she belonged to the En Lutte organization, the Marxist-Leninist Organization of Canada, which was headquartered in Montreal. Now, because of the fact that the referendum was coming in 1980, a whole lot of left-wing radicals moved into Halifax to try to do lots of educational organizational work around Quebec's right to independence and to self-determination, right? And so we had a whole lot of folks who were really active in Halifax and got active in the Black community as well. But Jackie was someone I became particularly close to. And when I left to go to university, the night before I left Halifax to go to the University of Waterloo, she took me to supper and she gave me Mao Zedong, 5 essays on philosophy, so which I still have and like very much. Also Lenin's What Is to Be Done, which I also like very much. Also a pamphlet by Stalin on, I think it was on organization or something like that, and Lenin on strikes. So I was well prepared when I got to the University of Waterloo. I was tutored by Jackie and tutored by Rocky, so I was like, a Black radical, yes, as a student, but in a very white engineering oriented, technically oriented university. So it was a really odd fit, but there I was, all because of Rocky and Joan. So the book is really, to come back to the reason why I'm telling you all this, is really about that narrative of how I came to understand that it was important to be an intellectual, that it was important to be a scholar, that it was important to think, that it was important to be an artist, that these were all extremely important activities and acts for us all, and that intellectuals have an obligation to speak for communities and speak against oppression and to be part of a community and to work for social justice, that is something that we are called to do because of our position in the society. At least that's what I believe, and I try to impart that same belief to my students and so on. One last very quick anecdote before I hope get a question or two. I now see we got a half hour left, so I got to move on really quickly here. But I got to share this anecdote with you because it's really a perfect illustration of the way things were in the early 1960s. So, following my parents' injunctions that I do well in school, I did do well in school. I love bringing home the report card that was full of gold stars and 90% and 99%, 100%. I loved all that. Even if the other neighborhood kids called me a nerd and called me Four Eyes and so on, and called me Brainiac and stuff like that, and Prof. I got called Prof as a kid. Oh, here comes the Prof. And then I turned into a professor. So, it was prophetic, I guess. You talk about being a prof. It was prophetic that I'd be. But anyway, but I didn't mind that because I wanted my father's regard. I didn't think I had it. I didn't think I had his love as a boy. So one of the few ways that he would show me his regard was if I showed him a great report card. If I showed him a great report card, he'd give me a quarter, saying, basically, well done, good job. And I could feel that I had his, that I had his esteem, that he held me in some esteem, that he loved me. I was really uncertain about that, and for good reason, which I talk about in the book. And you can read it for yourselves. I hope that you will, and find this out for yourselves. But I won't tell you. I'll just go on with the anecdotes. I can get it done, get it finished with. The anecdote is that when I was 13 years old, grade 7 in no, I got a better anecdote than that. I was doing well. I was always first in my classes in my working class elementary school. And they'd have a little graduation ceremony as you graduated from grade 1 to grade 2, from primary to grade 1, or from grade 2 to grade 3. They'd assemble us prize-winning students, pupils in the school gymnasium. They had some bunting up and so on, like well done, class of 64 or whatever. And they do a little ceremony, and we'd go up and we'd shake the principal's hand, and we'd get a little book from the Imperial Order of the Daughters of the Empire, right? So all of that was, and I loved it all. So it's like, hey, I'm special, and I'm one of the prize-winning pupils, excuse me. And for 2 years in a row, it's incredible, but it's absolutely true. For at least 2 years in a row, when I was like 6 or 7 or 7 and 8, grade 2 to 3 or grade 3 to 4, the guest speaker they had addressing us, working class kids, who actually did well in school was a beat cop. They brought a beat cop in to talk to us. And he had his firearm there, he had his nightclub there, his nightstick there, and he's standing on the little podium telling us that school was worthless. Now I'm going to repeat that. Here we are like elementary school kids, and we just graded. We actually graded. We actually passed. And some of us are like gold star kids. And we're about to move up a grade. And we're all excited. And our moms are there, or maybe our dads are there too. And everybody's dressed up, and it's a great occasion, nice little ceremony for us all. And the beat cop gets up on stage and says, school is worthless. I don't know, reading is worthless. Books are worthless. You shouldn't be doing that. You should be like pursuing sports. You should be learning how to box. You got to know how to fight in order to survive in the society. He's telling 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds that school is pointless, is worthless. You shouldn't be pursuing education. Go out there, get the boxing gloves on, and go and play basketball. Don't be sitting here reading and studying. The school invited the guy in to tell us that school was pointless. And the only way that makes sense is that the school itself was party to a system of actually alienating us from the understanding how worthwhile it is to have an education. No matter what kind of occupation you pursue, and every honest occupation is a good occupation. But to tell us that it's foolish to be reading books, we should be, doing the boxing. If that's what you got to do, what you got to worry about. So, yeah. I mean, that was, I would sit there, I would feel humiliated, I would feel ashamed. I just got a gold star. I just graded. I'm the #1 kid in my class. And I've got this adult who's a policeman, an authority figure, telling me that all my hard work was useless and ridiculous and stupid, right? And that the kids my age, my peers, were right when they're telling me, oh, why are you wasting time going to the library? Why are you reading all those books? But they were right, right? And the cop was saying, yeah, they're right. Your parents are wrong. They're right. Your teachers are wrong. They're right. Look at me. I didn't grade from any grade. I just showed up and they gave me a badge and a gun and said, go to work. And I could bring that right into the present today. I mean, when Doug Ford announced last fall that new police recruits do not have to have 2 years of college, they can go basically straight from high school to being weaponized, straight from high school and get weaponized and go out and do policing. All that means is that you're going to have more guys coming out, probably mainly guys coming out who don't know any history, who don't know any sociology, don't know any psychology, don't know anything, except that they are empowered to be able to take somebody's life or beat somebody up or throw somebody in prison on trumped up charges. And they'll do it because they literally will not know any better. And they will feel that they have been given a license to do exactly that by the premier of this province. So all this stuff is interconnected, but I'm talking too much. So please ask a question. All right, yes, Neil, thank you.
So George, I've been intrigued by listening to you. I've heard you many times. This is the most intriguing talk I've heard you give in a long time. So here's my question. And I don't want to go on because I want to move on. Well, you are one of a very few Black working class intellectuals in Canada. Forget Canada, but let's just restrict it to Canada. My question is, why is that so? Why is that so? Because there were other kids, there were other Black kids in Halifax, there were other smart kids who went to school, there were other people who were encouraged. How come none of them went to, well, very few of them went to university in your generation? In your generation, why is that so?
Neil, I think the answer to that is what I've just been saying.
Correct.
Yeah.
I know, but so say it more. I'm intrigued by the way that you frame. I do want to hear about the divorce and what happened there, but I am intrigued by the way that you've shaped the story. I love it.
Philip, before I take your question, I'll just share one other quick anecdote, very quick. Now I'm 13 and it's grade 7 in my working class junior high school in Halifax. And a guy comes in from what was then called Canada Manpower, right? It's now Employment Canada. But a guy comes in from Canada Manpower, an agent of the state, comes into my grade 7 math class. And he says to us, we're class 30, 40 pupils. And he says, you're all going to sign up for your social insurance numbers today. And I say, hey, great. Well, that's wonderful. I'm going to get a number, a card. I'm becoming an adult. This is fun. I'm 13 years old. This is great. And then, of course, he gives us the rap that you'll be able to go to work and get paid. And maybe somebody asks, like, oh, what kind of jobs can we do? So babysitting and you might be able to do some other kinds of jobs, when you're able to leave school at age 16, right? Now, of course, some of the kids in that classroom, even though it's only grade 7, they have failed. They have failed previous grades. So some of the kids in that class, I'm 13, but some of them are 14, some are 15. There might even have been one 16-year-old in that class, depending on how many grades they had failed to that point. So we've got this adult from employed by the government of Canada coming into our working class math class to tell us that we need to get our social insurance numbers so we can get our cards and we can go to work. Yeah, and no consultation with our parents. We're not 16. Most of us, of course, we're not 16. We're not, certainly not 18, but our parents are not consulted. We're just told to sign the forms and that's that. And of course, what a lot of the kids were thinking was, I think I can say this. They were thinking, oh, great, I can drop out once I turn 16 and I can go to work and make some money and so on. And the other part of this, to continue with this analysis, because it's actually quite devilish. It's quite diabolical what the government was doing through this particular agent. Because what they would know, and what many of us 12 and 13-year-olds would not know, is that by the time that we're 15, 16, 17, we're beginning to become sexually active. Some of us are going to impregnate girls, young women. Some of us are going to get married when we're 16. Some of us are going to be either unwed mothers or we're going to be very young parents, even if we do get married with our parents' permission. The government knows all of that. They know the actuarial tables. They know from the statistics what the likelihood is of any number of us actually getting into and out of high school without becoming a parent and going to work with limited education and therefore being forced to become part of an underclass, just like our parents were underclass. So we're going to become underclass and we're going to pass that on, because how many 16-year-old parents are going to be able to raise their children to be able to say, now you are going to go through high school, you are going to go to university. And then given the limited income they're likely to experience, how are they going to have the wherewithal to support their kids and get them through high school and on to university? So it's a long answer to the question. I'm sorry for the other anecdote, but it took me a long time to understand that this stuff, we talk about structural racism, it's real. We talk about structural classism, it's real. Even though some of us may have thought, and even the teachers may have thought, oh, this is kind of innocent, that, here's Canada Manpower and, telling our pupils that one day they will be workers and this is a good thing. That's great, fantastic. But the actual context of it is that the government of Canada does not expect us to go to university. Our options are probably going to be either relatively unskilled, low-skilled laboring positions or the military.
Right.
That's what's waiting for us. Salute the Queen. Thank you. Aye, aye, and off we go to fight and kill and die, wherever it is that our masters tell us to go, right? So, Philip.
Well, I was just going to comment that, just to pick up on what Neil said, I think that from your narrative and what you've shared so far, you had the foundations of a loving family and an extended family, and you also understood that history, which is very affirming. As a teacher in the system, in the school system, I know that there are many insidious ways that there's no role for the working class. Everything in the society is run by the working class. But if you ask a kid in the classroom, would you like to be a worker? What do you think about being a bus driver or something? Most likely they will say, well, maybe I'll be a doctor or a lawyer and so on. So there are structural things that still go on, I think, that tell Black and brown kids, minority kids, that, go to the army, especially from the working class, especially in the working class.
Yeah, exactly. Go into the army and accept to, follow the instructions and the commands of your superiors, and basically just limit your options completely. Another question, please. Yes, Yang.
So I'm just wondering, do you see any changes now? So like to Phil's question as well, because I came to Canada in 2010, and I thought, I still think, Canada is now embracing this diversity inclusion idea, and it seems people, it's not that equal completely, but people are embracing this idea. So do you see a lot of changes in that regard? Like people of color are not encouraged to, go to higher education, or they are actually, like things has changed. Or if you see a gap, what do you think we can do, like the whole society can do to improve that situation?
Yang, I welcome that question, and I do think that things are better. I do think that some things have changed. I do think that more and more of us love and respect the fact that we have a multicultural and diverse society. And I, for one, love the work that East and West Learning Connections is doing. And I'm really pleased and happy to be honored and privileged to be your guest this evening. And I support this organization and all other organizations like it that are about bringing people together. And I think that's really important right now. I'm going to say this very carefully, but while I think the vast majority of us like to get along, want to get along, love and support each other, there are also forces in our society that are intent on driving wedges between us and over lots of things that are not necessarily clear to everyone automatically all the time. And I got to read some poetry, but I am going to say this because I know that you are all very savvy and loving people. So I'll put it this way. It worries me that too many of our governments seem to be interested in war. It worries me that various nations are being demonized and have been demonized over the last few years. And I believe it's because they are considered to be threats, not to national security, but to our, with quotation marks, our economic supremacy. For all the talk that is put forward in our society about competition being beautiful, competition being a great way to decide what's the best and what's the worst, and so on, and that we all benefit from competition. When it comes right down to it, the reason why we have racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Indigenous attitudes, and so on, is because a lot of people don't want competition. They want to be able to tell certain groups, you're not allowed to compete. You're not allowed to enter this field. You're not allowed to be in this profession. And so there are structural things that are undertaken to actually reduce the level of actual competition that the society says it believes in. But that also extends to nations. We say we believe in free trade. We say that we believe in competition amongst nations. But when it comes right down to it, there are certain nations we don't want to be beaten by, that we do not want to be defeated by. And so then we demonize those nations and say that they are playing, that they are doing things that are cheating, that they have unfair trading practices. And we demonize them as well by saying, well, their systems aren't like ours, they're not as good as we are. And then we start to demonize the people. And then the news agencies are full of reports about, oh, there's a rise in hate crimes. There's a rise in prejudice. There's a rise in racism. There's a rise in anti-Semitism. And there are escalations in attacks on minorities, on sexual minorities, as well as other minorities. And it's all presented as if it's some kind of strange thing. But I would say back to those statisticians, I would say back to those journalists, you should not be surprised that there are increases in escalations in xenophobia. We see it in Europe, for instance, where actually fascist parties have begun to revive and have been strengthened because of the concern over immigration or illegal immigration, which has been driven by the destabilization of various nations like Libya, for instance, and Syria. The fact those two nations were destabilized by certain nations that we are in league with back 10, 20, 10, 15 years ago, has created the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean. So we have thousands of people dying in the Mediterranean every year because we destabilized governments that we did not like. So we thought it was a good idea to blast these governments or to stir up civil unrest and stir up civil war and so on. It's a long answer to the question, Yang. I want to answer it this way without getting into all the geopolitics. We, the people, the human beings of this planet, we want to be together. We want to get along. And every time that we do get along, that we have a chance to get along, we do.
Yes.
There's no problem. We get along easily. It's only governments that come in and divide us, for their own purposes and have us fighting each other and escalating hate crimes against each other there's no real reason. Who is oppressing us as people? Who's oppressing us as people? Who are the people who are oppressing indigenous people? Who are the people who are oppressing Black people? It's not everyday people who are carrying out those pressures, those oppressions. It's the people who benefit by carrying out those distinctions and those divisions that create the discord, that they then say, oh, we got to do something about the rising hate crimes that are increasing so rapidly and so on, and destabilizing the society. I got to answer the question directly. Yang, we will be together. We want to be together. And the people of this planet will be together because we have to be. Because if we allow the current systems to remain in place, there will be no planet. There will be no humanity because we will have destroyed ourselves in nuclear confrontation or through environmental despoilation, or both. So the writing is on the wall, clear as day. We're either going to share and care and be together, or we're going to end up destroying this planet. And if a few billionaires make their way to Mars, well, good for them, right? Good luck to them on surviving up there if they manage to get there. At least they won't be able to come back. That's one solution, is fire them all off up to Mars and let them stay there, build their own society on Mars, to become the first Martians, right? Real aliens, honest to God aliens. We don't have much time left, but I need to read a poem, at least a couple poems.
You were going to read about something.
Oh my God!
It's not in that book.
Yes, it.
Oh no, it's in there. Yeah, but no.
Okay, I've got to read a poem. I can always come to the question and answer. I mean, after we wrap up, I can always tell you more. So, okay, I'm going to read from this great book, Canticles III. This is the end of my epic poem, dealing with the construction of the African Nova Scotian peoples out of slavery, anti-slavery, colonialism, anti-imperialism, and of course, our particular understandings of Scripture. Where is here? Macintosh, crab apple, russet, sweet potato, cranberries, blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, strawberries, rhubarb, pear tree, hazelnut bush, worm-congested orchard, mushrooms, cabbage, carrots, lettuce, potatoes, turnips, beets, milk, honey, tea with cream, coffee with rum, grog, mead, wine, salt, a salted beer, maybe Keats, India Pale Ale, apple brandy, dandelion wine, sunflower wine, watermelon sugar, saltwater taffy, pumpkin pie, blueberry grunt, dulse, sauerkraut, fiddleheads, vinegared mackerel, fried smelts, buttered trout, salt cod, cod liver oil, lobster, crab, hippers, Solomon Gundy, pickled herring, fish and chips, pigtails, curried sausages, lamb with mint, chicken, turkey, veal, steak and fries, green tomato chow chow. Where is that again? What country is it? What tongue? What brogue? What accent? A Micmac calls it Megumaji. A Viking dubs it Markland. A Scottish king up and Latinized it, Nova Scotia. For New Scotland, no, new darkness, the other meaning for Scotia. New shadows rinsed by the Northumberland, burnt Umberland Strait. Nouvelle Écosse or Acadie, the drifting back exiled must choose, not the Dominion Atlantic Railway train, touting the apple blossoms of Acadia. What country is this? Bagpipe, star corner tricolore, Micmac drum. Whose country also is this, if not Africadia? Whyla Falls, Windsor Plains, Preston, Africville, colored Baptists, African Anglicans, Black Catholics, Negro Nazarenes, Ethiopian exhorters. Whose people am I, if not the race of poets? Thank you. I can read at least one more. Okay, I'm going to read. This is as I was suggesting, it's a work that is basically informed by history, very much so, including the history of the founder of the African Baptist Association, Richard Preston, who was an escaped slave from Virginia, and nobody knows very much about him. He kind of appeared, put together 20 churches, and then disappeared while he died. But no one knows much about him, whether he was married, whether he had children, what he looked like. Nobody really knows. So I decided to give him a backstory, including a girlfriend. Uh-oh. But, you know, it's poetry, so I'm allowed to do that. But don't tell the pastor that, you know, I gave him a love interest in here. But of course, now I got to find it. But I like to read it because it's just a very simple poem, a very simple love letter, love poem. I really should have a table of contents would be kind of nice at this point, but I do think it is later than earlier. Okay, so we're going to go later and hope that I can put my eyes on it here. Oh, I found it. All right. Whew. Here we go. April rain. April rain. It rhymes. It rhymes. How unmodern. Rain is one with April. How could you forget how our wet lips met? We kissed against the chill. You shivered in your coat as I clutched you close and kissed your cool nose and your wet lips and throat. Once we knew fire and chill, you've forgotten now, but I recall, though, each rainfall in April. Thank you. I can do one more. All right, let me try and find you a blues poem. Again, it's unlikely you're going to find a blues poem in most.
I think you should read Richard Preston in the Museum in the British Museum.
That's in the previous. That's in the previous volume. Yeah, thank you, sweetheart, for that reference. I had a lot of blues poems in the previous volume. I got to have at least one in here. But I could read Trotsky in Halifax. Oh, I know. Okay, this is great. This is great. Spirituals sung at the Africadian services. And one of these has just been turned into a song. So I'm going to read that one, and then I'll read one last one. But these are really, oh my golly. It's on number 63, Bedraggled Straggler. Bedraggled straggler, bedraggled straggler, how you going to get to heaven? How you going to get to Canaan? Got to trick the devil with your smile. Got to deep them hellhounds off your trail. Got to squirm like a worm through the field. Got to take God as your sword and shield. Gone drink down dew and chew up roots. Gone join Jesus in ecclesiastical cahoots. How else is you gonna get saved? How else is you gonna laugh at the grave? Ain't the Milky Way your starry river? Cross the Jordan, although you'll shiver. Take the North Star as your compass. The darkness is what each dawn outlasts. Bedraggled straggler, bedraggled straggler. No more be a laggard. Salvation don't wait on the laggard. Crawl and creep, then leap up, haggard, but free and stride where once you staggered. Stride, oh, stride where once you staggered. Bedraggled straggler, bedraggled straggler. And one last. Yeah, that has become a song already. And yeah, we debuted it in Halifax last month in February. Well, February last month, and there's just so much here to enjoy. If my tongue can't praise, the rocks in the ground gone shout. Let blasphemers hurl bashing rocks. What saints gone no rout? Thunder is how wisdom talks, proves the gospel's deep heartfelt, proves the gospel's deep heartfelt. The Bible's got truth to exclaim, truth to deliver. My eyes see lightning cry God's name. Mine ears must shiver. Storm clouds clock dismal and black as blame, but eyes raptured by the river. But eyes raptured by the river. Why you waiting for stars to bleed, the ruddy moon to fall? Salvation is the sinner's need. Let the devil bawl. Fire's gonna answer lust and greed. Better heed God's call. Best speed to God's call. Yeah. All right. I did not read as much as I wanted to read from this book, but I assure you that everything is just as astutely put together as I think the readings have suggested. I can go on for anyone who's interested. You know, I know we have reached the formal end of the program, but if you want me to read some more or talk some more, I'm happy to do so.
You were going to speak. One of the things you were going to talk about was the demise of your parents' marriage.
Oh yeah, I don't know why I'm laughing about it because it was actually quite as a 12, 13, 14-year-old, it was extremely difficult for me. And again, as I was mentioning earlier, if it hadn't been for those 6 elders coming to my rescue as a teen, I was 16, 17, I don't know what would have happened. I really don't know. The chapter is called Disintegration and Divorce. Yeah, Tammy Wynette, country and western, right? So here's the thing. Okay, well, yeah, I'll just say it. Whatever inchoate concept I had as a teen of heterosexual romance and coupling was soon troubled by an emotional and psychological domestic Gotterdammerung. My parents splitting. No solve, no bomb. It was like a mountain imploding, like an earthquake, spawning a tsunami. Dissolution began due to the collision between my father's patriarchal tyranny, which included his doling out money stingily to Jerry, my mom, on a proven need basis, and her activation of feminist ideals by putting her teacher certificate to use and earning an independent income. The tension between these two polar notions within the marriage increased significantly when, after studying anew child development theory via summer studies solo at the University of Ottawa in 1969, at age 30, Jerry became in 1970 the director of one and soon two daycare centers, two, located on Kennard Street, just around the corner from our house on Manor Street. Suddenly, our mom had an office, a desk, and a staff. She was the boss. She could no longer be a domestic serf to Bill, her husband, my father, of course. Now that she was responsible for employees that she charged to implement her pedagogy, which had been approved by government funders, perhaps she saw herself as living out locally a role similar to that of Mary McLeod Bethune, the pioneering African-American womanist, philanthropist, educator, and university founder. Like Bethune, Jerry was a proud, unrepentant race woman, active in the Congress of Black Women of Canada from its Halifax founding in 1976. Like Bethune, also, she knew that education is the crucial means to engineer class and race uplift. Jerry's success discombobulated one person, Bill, her husband. I can't say what my mother's income was from her daycare directorships, but even if it was less than my father's, it was hers, and he couldn't control her access to money anymore. No longer could he, in no uncertain terms, to use one of his pet phrases, dominate unquestionably our household. Jerry modeled the new woman, sexy, halter tops and hot pants, independent, her own paycheck, empowered, directing underlings, and yet also maternal, caring for her boys, but also several foster children that she and Bill, my father, brought into our home. In contrast to Jerry's professional progression, Bill was still a drone, a prole at the Halifax train station, a thrall to CN passenger rail, not yet via rail. He neither commanded his own office nor bossed others. Yet he'd attended Labor College in 1967 in Montreal, taking courses in economics, history, sociology, political science, and theory and practice of trade unionism. But none of that, nor one term at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in early 1970, proved efficient to let him escape his wage slave status. Change, which had arrived at our doorstep originally via Playboy's live and let live libertinism, hedonistic liberalism, was now arriving via Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex and its offshoots. But Bill sought to maintain the ancien regime. Once my mom returned to the workforce, she could not prepare our lunch or tidy up. The solution, to hire a maid. But we had to hire two to end up with one. Our first maid was a mousy-looking white woman with cat eyeglasses and a busy bee stove scouring and cooking ethic. Our kitchen was small, but she hustled and bustled in rustling up lunch and muscling through the cleaning. I could still see her hunched over the oil stove, scrubbing and rubbing, removing char and grease, although nothing could eliminate the stubborn fragrance of bacon fat percolating in a frying pan. She lasted but 2 weeks. In a hushed conference in our living room, she tearfully told my parents that her husband had learned that she was working for colored people and so had put the kibosh on her employ. Although they were on welfare, our maid's husband could not stomach his wife working for us. We were a colored family engaging a white maid. Even as a 10-year-old, I realized it was an unorthodox arrangement. Keep in mind, too, that the usual setup in low-income Afro-Canadian households was that the unlettered father and husband would do catch-as-catch-can unskilled labor jobs, while the wife and mother would hold down a low-wage but steady post as a maid, cook and cleaner and nanny for a well-to-do or just middle-class white family. Often the Black help would be employed in service, which could mean that she'd spend up to 6 days per week with her white employers, requiting every need and whim, while only being able to see her own husband and children on her day off, Sunday. Did white fathers or husbands or sons or other males take advantage of, seduce, entice, coerce, rape the Black women who were well at their service? Assuredly. So it was a point of patriarchal pride for Afro-Canadian men like my father to see his wife and the mother of his children safely installed in his own home, as opposed to being exposed potentially to the empowered lechery of white male employers. So I go on and talk about that, but you want to get to the point about what happened in the marriage. So here it is. Enter our second maid, Brigitte, who was blonde, busty, and exuding tons of bonhomie with a dollop of gusto on top. She was Quebecoise, bilingual, had been a barmaid, and had a bellowing laugh. Her girth was generous and her mirth was voluptuous. Indeed, she was chubby, and I used to tease her relentlessly about her physique to show off just how snarky or bratty I was. She responded good-naturedly to my ribbing, seemingly, but one day, a few weeks after she took over our kitchen, my father took me aside and asked me to tone down my poking fun. I relented, for he was right, and I feared being on his bad side. What I didn't know, nor did Jerry, was that Bill Clarke had quickly begun an affair with Brigitte. It all made perfect sense. One way for my father to firm up, pun intended, his masculinity in relation to his wife's rise in status and independence and income was, as it turned out, to exercise authority, financial and sexual, over a maid. That she was white and forbidden made the situation all the more alluring and steamy. What do I mean? Well, I talk about some of the cultural aspects of Black-white relationships, particularly at that point in time. And I talk about my father's own boyhood and aspects of that would have made him very willing to undertake this extramarital affair with a white woman. So what's my mother's reaction? Well, leaping ahead, Bill and Brigitte likely pursued their secret love in 1970, and it went on maybe undetected, if even suspected by Jerry, until 1972. However, she did not confront Bill about his lover, though she did fire Brigitte once her suspicions were aroused. Jerry's further revenge was to take a lover herself. RJ, a Jamaican-born Dalhousie University student, a decade junior to herself. Jerry had found a lover younger than her husband, more highly educated than her husband, and darker complected than her husband. But Jerry kept her affair secret too. She also kept two other secrets that represented her studious betrayal or rejection of Bill's patriarchal order. She took driving lessons on the sly and purchased on the QT a brand new forest green two-door 1972 Ford Mercury Comet. Holy smokes. Not only was Jerry then, by the summer of 1972, her own boss with an office, her own income, and a staff, she also owned chattel separate from her husband, that is to say, the car. And she had a lover who was by incipient lettered degrees, Bill's better, a fact that would have rankled my dad. RJ boasted that his family's neighbor back home in Jamaica was none other than Sidney Poitier. Now, come on. You know, this state of mutual secret affairs plus a secret car and a secret superpower, that is to say, Jerry's ability to operate a motor vehicle, was akin to the mutual stockpiling of dynamite to be set off as marital doomsday blasts. Whoever first decided to make an issue of the other's lover. When the explosion happened finally that summer of 1972, it disintegrated our nuclear family. But the damage occurred in slow-mo, metastasizing over 21 months, almost 2 years. My brothers and I went from a state of suspended terror in regards to Bill's haphazard rages to a steady state of alarm as bickering, crying, cursing, slaps, threats, and damnation scored the classical music and the Motown that had once washed over our ears. So they eventually split and break up and separate. My dad stayed at the family home, and my mother moved out, and her boyfriend, RJ, the student at Dalhousie, ended up coming to live with us off and on because he kept his own apartment at near Dalhousie University, and that's so he could see other women, his classmates and so on, closer to his age.
Gosh, that's an intriguing story, and we can let people read your books because we have some books to, as prize. If some of us are lucky enough, they can get a free copy and they can ask you for a signature. Because now we're at the time.
Five.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone here can see that I'm, tumbling the papers back and forth. So there's no foul play is happening here. And so, okay, I'm going to close my eyes and choose the first number at random, and it is 11. And I am going to hold it up in front of the computer so you can see, yeah, it's 11. All right. Now, for the second number, closing my eyes, it's number 1. So just to demonstrate, there it is, number 1. And okay, moving the papers around again in my hand, picking one up. And this is this a 2? Looks like J.
9. 5.
Oh, it's 5. Okay. That was number 5. I know I didn't show it to you, but it was number 5. Okay. And okay, I think this is number 7.
4.
Oh, it's number 4. Sorry. Sorry. Okay. I won't say any more what they are if it's not really clear to me. Okay, and all right, I think this is
Last one.
15 is the last one.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
那个你是不是抄了一个？你那个先念吧。
Thank you, George.
All right. Now you can read about all of the factors in my life that drove me to therapy for 30 years. I'm just kidding.
Thank you for success.
Oh, well, thank you, Sierra. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you feel after you finish your book?
That's a great question. I did feel some catharsis in writing this book, and I'm sure I would not have written it if either of my parents were still living. I probably would not have, but because they aren't with me anymore, there was a certain freedom that I felt I could exercise. My mom's 2 of my mom's siblings are still living, my aunt and my uncle, and I don't know how much they've read of the book. My aunt read a few things and then corrected me, and I was really worried when she did that. So I thought, oh my golly, but you told me it was like this, and now I got it in the book, and you're telling me it was not right. But it's too late to change it now. There it is. But to answer the question directly, I feel that the book is a gift to my community, to my family. Now, because I ended up talking about the pressures on my parents from different directions, the reasons why they weren't actually cut out to stay together or even to be together in the first place. And as the book describes, I was born outside of wedlock. My mom and my dad got together 3 times in 1959, in May 59, and engendered myself. And I know that because my father kept a diary for only 1 year of his life, and that was 1959. He was in love with someone that he didn't end up marrying. He ended up marrying my mom because of me, because I was born. She kept my birth a secret from him because she knew that he was not in love with her. Right. But I was, as a boy, well, as an infant, I was very sick to death. And my mom's mother thought I might die. I was in the hospital, extremely, extremely ill. So my grandmother overruled my mother and called my father and told him to come and see his son before he was dead. My father was in Moncton. So then he came to Windsor Hospital, where I was, Windsor, Nova Scotia, saw me, realized that I was his son, after all. And then he courted my mother and she agreed to marry him. But they were they really did not belong together. I'm happy that they were together. I'm happy they were my parents. And I did have a happy childhood, except for a few things, but it was happy more or less. But my mom was looked, and there's photographs in the book, as you can see for yourself. My mom looked very, very white. She was part Black, part indigenous, as I am, and maybe part white too. I don't know about that, but that's a possibility. But she definitely looked white. And there's a photograph of her. I know you can't really see it that well, maybe at the back, from probably high school, that kind of thing. And she was told that she had a resemblance to Elizabeth Taylor, and she said, "Yes, I do." And she was also had a slight limp um, on her right leg. I think it was her right leg was a little bit shorter than her left, so she had to wear shoes with had a little special lift on them. Um, and so what I'm trying to get at here is that her family, her birth family, was actually relatively prosperous in relation to most Black families. Her father was a gypsum quarrier in Windsor, but he also raised vegetables and sold them in Halifax and made money. And so he was able to have his firstborn child, my mom, chauffeured to school because of her disability. And she also went to Windsor Academy, which was the Tony School in Windsor. And so she grew up pampered and with a sense of entitlement. But I don't mean that in a negative way, but she expected that she would be treated well because she was treated well by her parents, and she looked great, and she had schooling, and was interested in being a teacher and so on. So she expected to be treated well. My father. Oh, the other thing I say about her is that even though she looked white, my mother loved Blackness. Oh my golly, she was just so deep down Black. And when it came to the opposite sex, she loved Black men. Like except no substitutes. At one point, I was 15 in junior high school, and my junior high school science teacher, Ken McDonald was his name. He said to me one day, of course, I did well in science and all my subjects. He said to me one day, he said, this is after my parents' divorce. He said, "Look, do you think that you could ask your mom to have coffee with me?" I'll never forget this moment. I went home dutifully and told my mom that Ken McDonald was interested in having coffee with her. Well, I'll never forget it because she put her face in her hand and she laughed and she laughed and she laughed. She laughed until she had tears coming her eyes. She said, "Me and Ken McDonald?" I didn't understand it then. I was like, "Well, what's so wrong about Ken McDonald?" I was like, no. That was not happening. That was not going to happen as far as she was concerned. So she looked white, but she was really adamantly Black in soul and tastes and so on. My father was definitely Black, but his tastes were European. Right. And for the most part, except for Black music, as I was explaining earlier, he had to make room for Black music in his life. He had to. There was no way around that. But yeah, his tastes were Eurocentric for the most part. So there was a real clash in terms of their likes and their interests and so on. So they were very, and especially in terms of class, because my mom, as I say, grew up with a sense of privilege. And my father was born in the middle of the Depression, 1935. He was born into poverty, but it was also a very strange situation for him because his mother knew 5 languages and music, French, German, English, of course, Latin. I think it's just 4 languages in that, and music, right? So she was very, very scholarly, very erudite, her own father was a very distinguished and esteemed chaplain and minister and leader of the Black community. But she was the rebel daughter, and she went the other way. So she had a number of children by different men. And so in a sense, she was shaming the family name. And so what her father did, my great-grandfather did to set things right, was he arranged for her to marry Norris Clarke. And that's why I'm a Clarke. My father never knew his father, who was Norris Clarke, who's a sailor from Jamaica. My father never knew his father. And he disappeared during the Second World War. He could have been a victim of the Battle of the Atlantic, or he may have decided he didn't want to come back to his family in Halifax and decided to go back to Jamaica or maybe to Barbados. And there are ways in which he could have done that in those days as a Black Caribbean man working for the railway, as he did at one point, or just as a worker or soldier for the merchant marine. But anyway, make a long story short, my father grew up in a household, well, my father grew up in a barn, because what happened was, because his mom had decided to be a flapper, as opposed to being a sober and straightforward church lady, her father sought to set things right by marrying her off to Norris, who produced my father, and maybe another sibling. And then he gave her a home, which was a barn on Bel Air Terrace in Halifax. And so my father grew up having to chase rats around and kill them before going to bed. He had his brothers had to sleep 2 or 3 to a bed, and I describe it in the book as like they were like playing cards. Like you had a hit at one end and a hit at the other end, and somebody's feet and somebody's face, in the way they had to do it in order to share the beds. But not only did he grow up poor, he grew up with a sense of humiliation because of his mom. And even though we can look on that now and say that was terrible, this should not have happened, it did happen. And it was psychologically damaging for him. And it also caused stresses and strains between the Clarks that I'm part of and the White family that my grandmother was actually part of, right? And that was the surname, White. And a very esteemed, very well-regarded Black family, the Whites, originally of Virginia and now of Nova Scotia primarily, and somewhat Ontario too. But anyway, so for the two of them to get together was not a recipe for harmony, because my mom would have expected to be treated very well. But my dad was working out some demons that he had, some very serious demons that made him abusive, to put it very simply and directly, very abusive to us, his 3 sons, and to our mom, his wife. And that caused a sense of estrangement that never really was overcome. And especially because I blamed him for the divorce. I blamed him for starting everything off that resulted in the destruction of the marriage. And then that's one reason why during my teen years, I really needed to benefit from those elders, those mentors, because I didn't have a father figure in my life during those particular years of my maturation. So I know I've been talking a long time. It's 2 hours now. So one last anecdote. I got to share this. And it has to do partly with my decision to accept Jesus as my Savior and get baptized last Easter Sunday, April 9th in Halifax. A few incidents have happened in my life that I cannot explain otherwise as being only the result of divine intervention. And this is one of them. It's a crucial one. As I've been explaining, I ended up feeling rather estranged from my father in my adult years. And And that was true right up practically until his death, practically in 2005. I was 45 at that point. But I had been to see him in July, on July 1st, actually, Canada Day that year, and he tried to tell me that he thought he was dying. He didn't put it in those words, but he tried to tell me, but I didn't want to hear it because I was too angry with him. I still wanted to settle scores with him. I still had things to set right with him. So I didn't hear him tell me that he thought that he was dying. I just didn't hear it. Couldn't hear it. Didn't want to hear it. So I didn't hear it. And I went about my business, went about my life. And there was a family reunion that was being held in Ottawa for the white family, the white blacks, or I should say the black whites, rather, excuse me. Well, yeah, I can say it both ways, the white blacks, the black whites. Anyway, they're having a family reunion in Ottawa, and I really didn't feel like going. I hadn't gone to most of them. But my father called me a couple of weeks before and asked if I was going to go. And I said honestly, I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to go. I'm really unsure about that. And that was that. And I went to Texas, do some research for a book. And when I came back home, I was extremely tired. I was 5 days in Texas, on doing this research work, and I was just tired, really tired. Came back home to Toronto on a Friday afternoon, and the family reunion was the next day, Saturday, the next day. And I wasn't going. I said to myself, I'm not going. I'm too tired. I'm just not going to go. And then at 4 p.m., a voice came into my head and said, pack a bag, you're going to Ottawa. And I packed the bag, bought a last minute plane ticket, expensive. I flew to Ottawa. And I walk into the National Arts Center where the family reunion was taking place. And there's my dad. And that was the last time I saw him alive. Sorry. That was the last time I saw him alive. And so I know that there was something else going on to get me to go there and see. And we had a great night. It was a great night. Thank you. I've got books for sale.